Hello and welcome to my YouTube channel, or welcome back if you've been here before. Here we are talking about Islamic psychology, but also spiritual paths and finding the truth. So in this video, really, I would love to talk to you about some interesting concept which we don't have in Islam as such, but we do have in New Age spirituality. And this is where a lot of people stumble. They don't know how to proceed and what to believe anymore. This topic is all about past lives. So as you know from my previous videos, or if you haven't watched them, then I can tell you that I've been in New Age spirituality for most of my life. That's 20 plus years. When I was there, my set of beliefs were all about souls, reincarnation, contracts between souls, and much more. But I'll try to be more specific because we are focused on this topic today. So, of course, I believed that we reincarnate, we have many past lives. And I've read lots of books, whatever I could find on this topic. Weiss, Dolores to name just 2 out of 20 probably that I've read. And Dolores was one of my favorite authors. Dolores passed away a few years ago, but I was her devoted student and follower. And I've learned QHHT method, which was teaching how to put a person into a hypnotic state where we can you can say the spirit team or the invisible force or the subconscious, how she was calling it there. But a few years later, she said it's not the subconscious of the person. There is more, some kind of spirits or some helpers that we connect with and that help us with our task at hand. And her task at hand was primarily healing the person. And she was claiming in her books that she could heal, not she could heal, but those hypnotic sessions, they could bring healing, total healing, to pretty much any problem, issue, disease, disorder, and so on. And I mean, really, she was talking about like the most grave scenarios where the person didn't have much time to live even on this planet, sort of, later stages of different diseases like cancer. And these people were going to see Dolores and her waiting list was over a year long. So people had to wait for over a year to see her because she was so famous. She devoted 40 years or almost 40 years of her life to this work, past lives, reincarnations, and the stories behind it. And if some of you will say, well, it's all mind constructs, sort of, the mind is making something up, and this is what we see in hypnosis. I wouldn't take this theory lightly because Dolores, I remember she was explaining, and I've read most of her books, and as I said, I was her follower, and I remember as she was explaining, she was like a historian. She would actually explore those past lives, those stories of her clients, and she regressed hundreds of clients. She had clients every day. She was traveling from country to country to regress patients. And she was doing these hypnotic sessions in the US, next day in Russia, and then a week later in some completely different country. She really was famous in her work because she started in the 70s when this was frowned upon, and many people were almost condemning her for this kind of devil's work. But she persevered, and despite of people's criticism, she continued with this work and wrote many books. I don't know how many exactly, but I think it's over 15 books. And around 10 of them I've read, and some of them are really thick, like Convoluted Universe. I loved reading because it was all about, again, past life stories that people experience in hypnotic state and which she then kind of investigated. For example, if the person says, I can see myself in France in 15th century, and she would ask, what do you do? What do you do? Like, what's your job? Or what do you do day to day? And the person would describe what they're wearing, what they're doing, and so on. And then she would investigate. And she would say, indeed, in that century, in France, people did this. And what the person is saying in hypnosis is correlating to actual facts. So this is fascinating. And all other regression therapists who devoted their work also to this, like Weiss and others, they also explored this possibility that people come here and some of them, they know each other from previous times. So there are some kind of soul contracts where we decide who we're gonna meet with, who our parents are, and so on. So all this is strong in the area of New Age spirituality. There are books upon books on this subject. There are people who literally spend their life work on this subject. So, and then when you're coming to religion, Christianity or Islam, you realize that there is nothing about past lives. Islam says we have this life, we have the afterlife, and we have barzakh life. So the barzakh is until the day of resurrection, until we are assigned where we'll go to which level of Jannah, heaven, or hell, or anything like that. So Islam says we have three lives, which is a barzakh life, which is the grave life, until we are assigned where we're gonna go for eternity. So, and then we have the afterlife, which could be hell or hellish, or it could be heaven, or different levels of heaven, or some kind of level of heaven and hell. So we have all that, and we have this life, which is very quick and transitionary, and main thing here is to find that our connection with God, with Allah, and all our life here is devoted to our work with Allah, to connection with Allah, to worshiping Allah. So when we'll go to the afterlife, hopefully we'll go to a very nice place for eternity, right? So now I have people asking me, so what's with the past life? Like, what do you do with that information? Do you just discard it like something as non-existent? Because millions of people still believe. And if you saw that there are some videos about children who say that, Mom, you are not my first mom, I had other mom. And then they continue telling the story that they actually remember the past life at a small age. And there are many stories like this. There is a little boy, for example, who was crying at night in his room. And when the parents came into the room and asked him, why are you crying? He was saying, or he was repeating, this is all my fault, this is all my fault, this is all my fault. And they said, what's happening? And he was crying and saying that the boat or ship sunk because of him. The more they were questioning him, the more he was revealing that he was responsible for building some kind of ship. And so in the end, it turned out to be a Titanic. And he was saying that he was partaking in construction of the ship. And what actually happened is that the material that was used for Titanic actually wasn't the original one, which was supposed to be there. But people wanted to save money and they used cheaper material. And that made the ship less robust. And this is why it broke down. This was not supposed to happen. So why do you think there are 3 pipes or chimneys, what they call them, on the ship? Why there are 4 of them there on the ship? He would say 3 of them are working, 1 of them is for aesthetic appearance. So 4th one doesn't work, 3 of them are working. So this kind of fact he wouldn't know because he was a little boy. The parents also bought for him a game, a computer game, which was all about Titanic, where you could go inside and you can find different rooms and the whole layout of Titanic, basically. And the boy showed where his cabin was, where the captain cabin is. He didn't say he was a captain. He said that he was more like an architect of that ship. And this is why he knew what happened and when the ship sunk. This is one of many where children say that they remember some kind of past life, to the point where they can recognize their family members, like it happens in India in some cases. Again, what do you do with that information? Makes me think about a book which I was mentioning at some point. It's called Letters from the Afterlife, which I've read when I was about 15 or 16 in my dad's office, where he had his first computer at that time, and they were like files, MS-DOS files, if you remember that kind of thing. It's the first old type of files. So, and there were 42 files named Letters, and it was Russian translation at the time. So I started reading them, and I couldn't stop reading, because basically every file was describing the afterlife, how it is, from the perspective of a guy allegedly who died, and he was giving this information through his friend or friend's hand. So that friend was a woman, and she was a writer. So at some point she had this automatic writing where she felt compelled to write, and she would write not knowing what exactly she's writing. And eventually she would read it and she would say, oh my God, this is not me, that's somebody else is writing through my hand. That guy who was allegedly writing through her hand He was a lawyer and a philosopher from France. When he started writing through her hand, he said to her, "Don't be afraid, I am your friend, so and so." So she contacted his family, because at that time there was no computers, no phone, it was 18th century. She wrote them a letter, and then she found out that indeed that person died, and she didn't even know. So the letters continued. Eventually she just agreed to him using her hand, basically. And this is how they wrote 42 letters describing the afterlife where he allegedly is. He was describing that the afterlife, for the majority of people who are non-religious, not devoted to God on a daily basis or anything like that, just the majority of people, normal people, they go to the afterlife, which is very much is a replica of this one. Most people there recognize that they are in the afterlife. Some people don't. Some people still a little bit confused where they are, because the surroundings are very much like the previous life. I mean, the current life on Earth, right? Or the previous life for them. So very similar. They find similar people, they find similar buildings and their room and their apartment and so on. Some of them a little bit lost, especially those who were sick, for example, who lost memory before they died, for example. So for them, it's a process of confusion, somewhat. This is how he was describing. However, for the majority of people, they are assisted by spiritual beings who can guide them throughout this afterlife and show them what they can do there. And what do they do there? Again, like Brian Weiss and Michael Newton describe in their books, we all can work, study there if we want to, but it's for our pleasure, enjoyment, studying, development, and so on. It's not like we have to go to work to earn money anymore. This is more like evolution of the soul. So this is what we do there. But we also have some games and fun, and we can visit each other, and we can have a cup of tea together and things like that. So a lot of things pretty much are like here. This is how he was describing. I'm just telling you from that book. He also said that at some point, people reincarnate. They prepare for the next life on Earth, and with the help of the spirit guide, they're preparing for it. And at some point, they decide to meet with, for example, their family members, but maybe in different roles, which is aligned with Dolores Cannon's teachings. And they all reincarnate here as a family, just a different time perhaps. Some friends, they know each other from previous lives, and that's why we get affinity together, kind of, you know, we are aligned, sort of thing. With our friends, allegedly, we knew them from previous lives. So this is, again, this is all this new age spirituality, this past life, theories or whatever you can say, domain or whatever, because it's a big one, and it's a firm, and there is a lot of stuff there. Now, coming back to Islam, right? We know that we have only that barzakh, which is temporary life. We don't really have past lives, and we have the eternity of the afterlife. In the book of the letters from the afterlife, the guy also was describing, I mean, the guy who died, right? He was also describing there were many levels of hell and heaven in the afterlife. Where he was, it wasn't particularly hell or heaven. And he asked his guide, whoever was helping him to get to know the afterlife, to study, to learn, to progress, and so on, he asked him to show him different levels. To which his guide said to him, I cannot show you the highest levels because it's for people who are worshiping God. It's for religious people who live in that divinity. They were worshiping God on a daily basis. They go to a completely different level. It's the highest level, which I believe it's what is described in Quran, in Hadiths. It's exactly that level. Why? Because eventually this guy was granted to peek to that level of the afterlife, just for a moment. The guide said to him, we allow you to have a glimpse of what it looks like, but you cannot stay there because your soul hasn't developed to that degree. But because you are curious, and you are learning here and you're progressing here, which we can do in the afterlife, as he said. This is why he was granted permission to actually see that afterlife for a brief moment. And he said that the highest level of heaven was so amazingly beautiful It was all about light, love, divinity, amazing, stunningly beautiful place that we can only try to imagine. And I don't think we can even imagine. I don't think we have capacity to imagine how beautiful. So those people who were in the highest level of heaven were a different bunch of people. They were not from a general society. And this makes me think, what if Quran was written for people who devoted to God, who worship in God, who are learning to trust only to God and the divine plan which is coming from God for the whole thing. When you are becoming a practicing Muslim and you live in that life, you're worshiping on a daily basis, you're doing all your prayers, you refine your soul to that extent which it matches to the highest levels of heaven, and then you go there. Perhaps this is when you don't need to reincarnate anymore. And as Quran was written for people, inviting them to Islam, it couldn't say to them about some kind of reincarnation, because for them, they shouldn't be focusing on that. They should be focusing on becoming practicing Muslims, people who worship God. And actually, if you think, but what about Christians? I can say to you that Muslim, it only means that you are submitted to God. You submitted to God's will. This is what it means. That's all. So these are my reflections for today. And I really hope to get some interesting answers and some theories from you guys. What do you think about all these past lives versus we don't have past lives? Another theory, before I go, another theory is that perhaps our soul can experience other people's lives. And maybe, because in spirituality it says that there is no past or future, there is only present, only the now, and there are only probabilities that coexist at the same time, then perhaps those parallel lives to us, no matter which century they are right now, if you're following what I'm trying to say, maybe somehow in hypnotic session we are able to experience or to see someone else's life and we describe it as our own. That's another theory. As Muslims, we have to look from Islamic standpoint as well. So an Islamic standpoint doesn't acknowledge past lives. And this is with all these possible explanations of past lives, especially when it comes to children who allegedly remember their past lives, their past mom, and so on. What do we do with that information? What do you think about the book, Letters from the Afterlife? If you haven't read it, it is available on Amazon. It's reprinted from something like 1800 multiple times because it's a very interesting read. It really is. So, and perhaps the theory that the general population will reincarnate at some point, whereas those who are worshiping God don't have to do it anymore. So I'm eager to read your comments. Let me know what you think, and I will see you in one of my next videos.